What's up, Internet? This is Rambling Josh, and today I want to talk a little bit about pacing in games, and in particular, things about like player attention and player introduction, and how these things relate to the idea of player retention. And as far as what pacing itself is, this should be pretty self-evident, but I kind of think of it as how often interesting things happen versus how long your experience is. And what those interesting things are, it could be any number of things. It could be like introducing a new gameplay mechanic. It could be like introducing an interesting plot point or plot twist or what have you. Chances are you've watched a movie or played a game or read a book or what have you. This is a problem with pretty much every form of media, where you've looked back at it after the fact and said like, man, the middle was really slow, or you thought like, oh, why was this so long? They could have cut out like 20% of this and it would have been fine. And those are pacing problems. But that's kind of only one kind of problem, right? Because pacing problems arise when your balance of interesting things happening is not in balance. It can happen when there are gaps of not enough interesting things happening, so it starts feeling boring. But you can also have the opposite problem, where you can have too much happening all at once, and you run into the problem where you overload the player. You throw too much at them that more than they can process all at once. And that's when things start getting confusing, and that kind of leads into the idea of player introduction, which is a problem that's more unique to games, unlike everything else about pacing. See, the thing about media is that when it comes to mediums like books and movies and music, they kind of differ from games in that they're a passive medium, right? And this is something I've talked a little bit about before, but one of the ways where this difference exists is the fact that the creator is 100% in control of the pacing of their product. Whereas in a game, the player is inherently a part of that process because they're the ones that is controlling everything. So this kind of goes even a step further, whereas at the beginning of the game, you basically have to teach the player how to play your game, which again is not something that those other mediums have to worry about, because you could say that a person can learn how to listen to music or learn how to watch a movie. That kind of goes into the more like if you're like a critic of that particular medium. But in general, you don't have to teach someone how to watch a movie. They inherently know how to do it. They turn the movie on and they look at it for an hour and a half or however long the experience is. That's not that hard. But with a game, usually you kind of assume that the person going into this experience doesn't know how to play the game. And so you have to teach them. And that's where problems with new player experience comes in. And that kind of goes back to what I was saying a moment ago about overloading the player. Now, the concept of like tutorials and new player experience and all that is like a big, huge topic that like nobody has like super great answers for. Everyone kind of knows what they're doing, but it's, different games do it differently. Some games have good tutorials, some games don't. Some games you don't even realize they have tutorials. But in the end of the day, tutorial or no tutorial, one of the big concepts of like a successful tutorial is kind of easing the player into it. And the idea there is that you're trying to avoid that overloading thing. So you're reducing the amount of concepts that the player has to process early on so that they can kind of get one concept and then move on to the next concept and just so on and so forth. But this concept on its own is actually kind of at odds with the whole idea of player retention. So like the concept of retaining a player is the first thing you have to do is hook them. And I think you can make the argument that the hooking process is almost not even necessarily something that happens within the game itself. I think you could say that if someone has decided to dedicate the time to play your game and the resources to purchase your game, then you've already created some amount of hook there. They've already invested something into your game, and so they're going to feel some kind of obligation to keep going. Of course, this is becoming less and less true as time goes on, as we're seeing more and more free games, and at that point it's like all you got to do is download them, so the barrier to entry is very small, but also the amount of attachment that creates is very small as well. So actually obtaining the game is not creating that much of an attachment versus, say, like the game that you pre-ordered for $60 and then waited a year and a half to come out. But I digress. I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that the whole concept of the player introduction and the player onboarding sequence is perhaps one of the hardest pacing challenges in a game. Because I've talked a bunch about the idea of you don't want to overload the player, you want to give them things happening in digestible chunks. But you also have to give them something interesting to grab onto to create that hook. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the games I've played recently that inspired this topic. One of them is a game by the name of Recore. So this little title for the Xbox One is a game that I was pretty interested in. It had some names behind it that I was interested in following their work. They previously made games that were very interesting to me, and I wanted to see where that went. So I picked it up, and at this point I probably played like 30 to 45 minutes or so of it. And the reason I only played that much of it is because it didn't really hook me. I'll probably play more of it at some point, but in that time, I just wasn't really impressed with what I saw. And part of that is just down to overall game quality. It just seems fairly low for the most part. Like, I guess the gameplay is okay, but it doesn't look very, like, the graphics are not very good, and this and that and the other thing. But also, it just feels very generic, right? And I feel like there's probably more to it, but it just doesn't get there at the beginning. It starts off teaching me very basic, very simple things. Press X to jump or whatever. I don't know the buttons on an Xbox controller very well. I guess it's A. It's like press A to jump, press B to dash, press right trigger to shoot. And it's like, yes, okay, I understand. I know how to do these things. I've played a video game before. And kind of the concept of a new player onboarding process is that you have to needle all these little controls into the player, but when you spend the first big chunk of your game doing that, it's like a waste of time. Like, teaching specific controls is almost not even a useful thing, because for most players, if they've played a video game before in their life, then probably what they're going to do right off the bat is try all the buttons and see what they do. Especially in a game like Recore, where for the most part they basically just throw you into the first level and say, go do your thing. Jump around, do some platforming, shoot some bad guys. Players are going to experiment and figure it out on their own. And so it's good to give them some time to do that, to get used to the controls before you throw any challenges at them. But I was also never really given anything interesting to come back to. So my first impression of this game is that if I ever want a generic platformer to come back to, then Recore is my game. And probably a more extreme example of kind of the same thing is Mario and Rabbids Kingdom Battle. Another game that I was very excited for. And that's one that I've played probably about 3, maybe a little bit more hours of at this point, and I have a pretty similar feeling for that game. Like, obviously it doesn't have the problem of like it feels very generic, it feels very low quality. It's a very pretty game, it looks like very high quality. But in the time that I've played it, nothing interesting has happened. Basically, my experience with the game in the first 3 hours is rabbits are annoying. Why can't I customize my guys more? Is this just a stock tactical RPG? Like, what is the appeal of this game? And I know that it comes later. People have told me as much. It's pretty evident from like reviews and all that kind of stuff. But the game drags its feet so much. And I think a lot of that is because it is a Mario game. They want to cater to maybe younger audiences who are less informed about this kind of stuff. It is an XCOM type of game, so that's maybe a little bit more complicated for the average gamer. Whereas, I've never really played much of XCOM. I played a little bit. But, I can understand these concepts pretty quickly. But the game just takes so long to introduce anything of any actual interest that I know that it's a game that I'm going to want to play more of, but I find it really hard to motivate myself when the first however long of this game is like, it's a hurdle that I have to get past. And that's a pacing problem, right? How many games have you played or had friends who played, who talked about, who were like, oh, just make sure that you get like 20 hours in because that's when it gets really good. And that's so bad. That's not okay. Like if you can stomach the first 20 hours of the game and you can get to that rewarding bit, that's fine. But realistically, you have to hook your player in like the first hour or 2 hours of the game, or else you can't expect anyone to get that far. No matter what the word of mouth is, like you have to show them right off the bat why they want to keep playing their game. And if you take too long to kind of like drip feed the interesting stuff and like here's all the cool little mechanics, and if they can't at least see where it's going, then you're just completely failing. And that's definitely the case for Recore. For Mario and Rabbids, it's like, yes, I know this is going somewhere, but please, please, please just get there faster. And maybe, this is coming from me, someone who has a lot of experience playing games over a very long period of time. I have a lot of experience with different genres, with different concepts and game design and all this kind of stuff. So maybe, I'm just more informed about this kind of stuff. I have a lot less time in my daily life than I did once upon a time. So maybe it's just me being impatient, me needing less hand-holding than the average gamer. But it's the kind of problem that is inevitably going to happen more and more as more games come out. And as someone who, I've seen, these are both games that I started within the last week for the first time that I was excited to play, and my initial reaction to both of them has been so far like, oh, well, this is kind of boring. I'm going to go play a game that I know is good instead, like Breath of Fire 3, which is what I've been playing instead. Anyways, that's just kind of mostly just a thought dump about that whole concept of like I said, pacing and player introduction and all that kind of stuff. So maybe, hopefully that was interesting to you, and I will see you next time.